It's a great honor to be here and to introduce Lawrence A. Pezzullo, which I did about 2 years ago here, the second time he spoke here. And I thought at that time, you know, Catholic Relief Services is one of the really important things in town, and a lot of people don't know what it is. And its chief is one of the really important people in Baltimore, and a lot of folks don't know him. This man really needs an introduction. And I read up, studied everything I could find out about him, and I told all. This time, Lawrence Pezzullo needs no introduction to a group as well-informed as this. However, for the benefit of a few people who may have been out, let me refresh your memories. He was a career Foreign Service officer who became ambassador to Uruguay, and late in the Carter administration was sent to Nicaragua in an emergency when the government there was collapsing to convince the dictator, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, who was a good old friend of this country, that it was time to step down. Which he did. And he's written about it with his son Ralph in a book that just came out last January. That's a very good read, an exciting book, and I recommend it. He stayed on as ambassador to Nicaragua for 2 years, and he retired from government service early in the Reagan administration. He was heard to criticize the Reagan administration's change in policy or continuation of what he was building in Nicaragua. And in 1983, he was asked to become the chief executive of Catholic Relief Services. This is the principal foreign aid, foreign charity arm of the Catholic Church of the United States. It's operated directly by the bishops. It was always run out of the Archdiocese of New York, and he was its first head who was not a bishop. In 1989, he supervised its coming to Baltimore. And he's been a Baltimorean then for 5 years. And it was in that role that he has spoken twice to this group. In March of '93, you will recall that the Clinton administration was a little slow making its appointments. He was asked to retire from Catholic Relief Services and re-enter government. Warren Christopher, with whom he had worked closely in Nicaragua, was then the Deputy Secretary of State, was now the Secretary of State. Mr. Pezzullo became President Clinton's principal advisor on Haiti. It was pretty clear he was meant to do for Haiti what he had done for Nicaragua, which was to persuade a general to go away. What seemed to be the highlight of this tour of duty came just 3 or 4 months later in the Governor's Island Conference of June, July 1993. General Cedras agreed to step down and agreed that President Aristide should return to power. Everything looked very good. When some people, that means me, think the Clinton administration pulled the rug out from under Mr. Pezzullo, was in October, which was when the general was supposed to step down and the president was supposed to return. And a U.S. Navy ship to Harlan County appeared off Port-au-Prince with 200 troops who were supposed to go ashore to pave the way for an orderly, peaceful transfer of power. There was an ugly mob greeting them on the shore, and the White House pulled the ship away. The troops never landed, and the general stayed. From here, things started to seem to go downhill. The general showed no signs of leaving. The administration came under criticism. So did Mr. Pezzullo from the more ardent friends of President Aristide. He was identified with a policy of trying to persuade President Aristide to make coalition with Haitians who had opposed him in the past. And some people thought this wasn't necessary. And besides, they wanted Aristide back and Cedras out. There was quite a crescendo of this, and, well, you can't fire the president, and I don't think you can fire the Secretary of State over Haiti. I think you need a bigger country. To some extent, that's what ambassadors and special advisors are for, I think, is to take the heat. On April 27, Mr. Pezzullo was persuaded to step down. He was replaced by former Congressman Bill Gray. In my mind, at that time, our invasion of Haiti became inevitable. There was no way for it not to happen, I suspected, because the Clinton administration was now wedded to a stronger policy than had been its policy. Well, I'll find out if that's right. He was not bound to silence, and he wrote articles giving his views in such places as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Baltimore Sun. I will not summarize them. You will soon be in no doubt as to his views. In September 19, our invasion began. Mr. Pezzullo's speech is entitled, "Clinton's Haiti Policy, a Study in Maladroitness." I looked that word up in the dictionary. I didn't want to get it wrong. It is an absence of skill, cleverness, or resourcefulness in handling situations. It's a great honor for me to introduce a truly distinguished American, Baltimorean, public servant, humanitarian, and practitioner of foreign relations on the razor's edge, Lawrence Pezzullo.
Well, it's interesting. My youngest son, David, says I'm only comfortable when I'm in a tough situation. I think that qualifies as being a masochist. But let me sort of deal with the Haiti issue in a couple of bites, so you can get a sense of what the Haitian milieu is, the country is, very quickly. Then a sense of what we were trying to do in terms of putting together a policy, which ended in the Governor's Island Agreement of July 3rd, 1993, and then some of the events internal to the administration, which I think have put us in a position where we now have 20,000 troops in what I consider a failure of a major sort in terms of trying to help another country restore democracy. But let me go to Haiti first, because I think it's an absolutely fascinating country. Little known about it in many ways, an insignificant little country in terms of the larger countries in the world that we deal with. As you know, Haiti was the first country where a successful slave revolt occurred, breaking itself away from a major European power, France, at the time of Napoleon. The revolt began just 2 years after the French Revolution. And the Haitian people so oppressed by French rule, took up arms and began to fight against the French. Now, the country up until that time was called Saint-Dominique, was the jewel, believe it or not, of the French colonial rule. It produced 2/3 of all the products that went to France from all their colonial colonies. It had a plantation system, produced sugar and all kinds of cash export crops that went to France, and as I say, became its crown jewel. At the time of the revolution in Haiti, it was producing more for export than the American colonies. It was a very productive country. And then, unbelievably, a group of slaves overthrew the best of the French army. Napoleon sent 20,000 crack troops to Louisiana because he wanted to shore up the French position in Louisiana against the expansion of what he thought were the American colonies, and sent his brother-in-law, Leclerc, as the general to just put down this slave revolution in Haiti. Well, Leclerc lasted 1 year and he died, and the 20,000 troops were destroyed. Another general came in, and after 60,000 troops and 12 years of fighting, they gave it up. So Haiti was born, and Haitians are very proud of this, from them taking up the cudgels for their own independence. They fought, they defeated a major colonial power and became a country. And therein began the real problems of Haiti. The country was really run as a plantation, a series of plantations, very productive, as I say. Within a very short period of time, that fell apart, partially because the farmers or the slaves who were on these plantations decided to take up farming for themselves, went off into the interior, and the plantations went down. And the export crops from Haiti diminished dramatically over the next 4 or 5 years. And the leaders of the revolution turned out, each one of them, to be anything but a capable leader politically. And the country began what turned out to be a practice within Haiti of abuse of power by strongmen, executives, despots, whatever word you like. And that has continued on unbroken throughout the history of the country. It got worse during the Duvalier period, because Duvalier not only was a despot, but he was a very pernicious sort of despot, and turned Haitian against Haitian. He used the black mulatto or black blanc issue that they talk about in Haiti for political purpose, to weaken enemies, to undercut institutions, including the military, and develop within Haitians a sense of paranoia. One of the Haitians I respect very much, Robert Malval, who was the prime minister under Aristide, one time told me, he said, "Larry, 99% of Haitians are paranoids, and that includes me." And he was not saying this in a demeaning way, even to himself. The history made them that way. They have no faith in themselves, in institutions, in their friends, or in anything that you might call the basis for a civilized society. That is the history of Haiti. After the fall of Duvalier, his lame-brained son stayed on a while, Baby Doc. And finally, Baby Doc was pushed out in '86, and there was a tumultuous period after. But during that period, a group of well-meaning people, including some American experts on constitutional law and so on, came together and wrote a new constitution for Haiti. And the constitution was modeled on the French constitution and developed a parliamentary system, precisely because there was a great concern about the abuse of power by the executive. So they went to a parliamentary system, which, as you know, has two executives, a president and a prime minister, and they They share, one is the chief of state, the other one is chief of government. But basically the prime minister is the executor. He's the man who runs the government. And then the parliament, which never had been much in Haiti, was given a great deal of authority. And by the very nature of a parliamentary system, the prime minister had to have a parliamentary majority to govern. Otherwise, in most of the parliamentary systems, if he doesn't have that, or she doesn't have that parliamentary majority, they have a vote of confidence and out they go, and the president or the queen, in the case of England, looks for another candidate. That was the system put in. That was the system that eventually led to the elections of 1990, which were the first really overseen elections in the history of Haiti. There were innumerable Americans and other international observers who went in, oversaw that election, and it was as clean and as free and as open as I think you would find in any country, including Haiti. The principal parties had all put up candidates for the presidency as well as the parliamentary seats. The man now who's president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was not a candidate. He did not belong to a political party. He came out of a church movement, liberation theology movement, which saw the need for basic reform, radical reform within the country. And in fact, he thought the election was a waste of time and spoke against it. But shortly before the election, he had a change of heart. And he joined one of the legitimate parties, a party called the CONACOM Socialist Party, Liberal Party, and ran as a candidate in a coalition with them under what was called the FNCD. And he won 67% or something like that of the vote and was elected president. The CONACOM FNCD coalition gained one vote majority in the Senate, and they were not in majority. They had a minority holding in the lower chamber. So they were a minority party in terms of creating a government. That government that Aristide then formed was a government that did not, for reasons that only he can explain, did not form the coalition required of a constitutional government or a parliamentary system. He named a prime minister who had neither political experience or political reach. It was a very partisan administration. Aristide came in with a fairly weak cabinet and began experiencing difficulties in governing, which was understandable since he didn't have the majority in the parliament. He ran into problems very early with the parliament. His prime minister refused to go to the parliament when he was called, which is a basic requirement on the parliamentary procedure. Instead, the mob showed up and threatened the parliamentarians with necklacing. And the troops came out. And the taste in everybody's mouth was very bad. On the military side, he took the general who had overseen the elections, a General Abraham, a general who had some prestige within the military and enough courage to hold free and fair elections, and he fired him. And he took a major, fellow by the name of Raul Cedras, and made him commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Cedras was a staff officer who didn't have much prestige within the military. And the act itself of firing Abraham and naming Cedras was unconstitutional, because the Constitution, written in '86, to preserve the control of power within the executive so that a president couldn't be arbitrary, holds that the commander-in-chief is named by the president, he's confirmed by the Senate, and he fills a 3-year term uninterrupted. The president cannot dismiss it, nor can the president, under the ongoing requirements, name a commander who does not hold a certain rank within the military. But Aristide did both. He fired Abraham, and he named the major as commander-in-chief, again creating problems for himself within the military. And then there were other episodes having to do with policy issues, which were, in most cases, not the policy issues that he could get implemented throughout the country because he didn't have the political basis support within his own parliament. These became confrontational. He resorted to rhetoric, criticizing various and sundry people, the private sector, the international community, which was constantly being accused of all kinds of evils, and the mobs became a problem. This eventually led, after 7 months of his rule, to his overthrow by, and all our intelligence indicates, by a movement that began among the young soldiers, what they call the T soldat in Haiti, which means the non-coms or rank and file of the army. They were the ones who began the movement against Aristide. They're the ones who live in the poor barrios, in the favelas around Port-au-Prince. They're the ones who felt unsure about their own futures and some of the wave of uncertainty that was developing. Aristide was taken to Cedras by the troops. Cedras had a choice of either joining the revolt or going down with it. And in good Cedrasian fashion, he went with it. And he called the American ambassador and the French ambassador and asked them to get Aristide out of the country, which they did. Aristide could have been killed. Cedras could have turned them over to the troops. So to some extent, as weird as things are in Haiti, and Haiti is a place where things are normally not what you see, Cedras, to some extent, saved the life of Aristide, as did the American ambassador, who later, in a statement made by one of Aristide's spokesmen, was accused of spawning the coup. And when I took exception to that publicly, they said, "Oh, we were just kidding. We didn't mean that." Anyway, so that's what happened to Aristide. In came a group of military no less capable of governing than what had come here before them and before Aristide and before throughout the history. Abuses occurred. The paramilitaries that you hear about, these attachés and so on, were built up. And pretty soon, they were benefiting from the contraband and the normal corruption that occurs in a country like Haiti, but the ruling of the country was going downhill. At the same time, the international community, with great enthusiasm, attacked the overthrow, broke relations almost to a country, the only country that maintained relations with the Vatican. But every other country in the world broke relations, withdrew their ambassadors. And the OAS, the Organization of American States, imposed sanctions, which were, they were voluntary sanctions, but the United States imposed them quite vigorously. But they were not stringent enough to really curtail the trade into Haiti. The Bush administration had gone through the 7 months of the Aristide period, had come away with somewhat of a jaded view of Aristide, joined the international community in criticizing the coup. We broke relations and all. But the enthusiasm for really doing something was not there. There was more rhetorical attacks by the U.S. government, but no action, no real push behind it. And then you know what happened during the campaign. Clinton criticized the Bush administration for the handling of the refugee issue and said he would do something more activist. And then before he took office, but after being elected, he reversed himself because he was told by his advisors, you're going to stimulate a flood of refugees coming in. By the way, most of those refugees, by our own by our own screening, something like 75% were economic refugees with no question. The same type of refugees that have been leaving Haiti for decades. Haiti is a non-viable economic country. The country of the late early 1800s is no longer there. It's a despoiled country with its soil eroded, its trees gone, and its economic basis terribly shaken. Plus, they now have some 6.5 or 7 million people. So the opportunity just to make it in Haiti is so severe, and there are talented people, that the exodus is really economic, largely economic. They've been leaving there in droves for years. Most of the Haitians in this country came not because of political oppression, although some did. Most of them came here because here you could get an education, you could make it in this great country of ours. So Clinton reversed and felt, and was criticized for it, and felt somewhat taken aback. And then, as Dan said, in March, I was called and asked if I would come in as an advisor on Haiti. Now, let me just briefly go through that period, because I don't want to go on too long here, and then I want to talk about where we are and why I think we shouldn't be here, but what we should do now that we are here. When I came in, I found, as normal in the U.S. government, there are different pockets of attitude in different agencies. The intelligence community, almost to a person, thought Aristide was flaky and didn't deserve to be a president, and if he went back, he would cause problems. Therefore, as far as they were concerned, he was not worthy of support. The Pentagon, on the military side, didn't take a very strong position. Usually you find on the uniform side a lot more discipline. They were just concerned about any military intervention in Haiti. I'm sure they're concerned right now. On the civilian side, I think the attitude was more than anything reflective of what the intelligence community was saying. So the focus of sort of putting a policy together rested on very few people, and I was the center of this. My position had been right from the outset that if we were serious about doing this, then we had to have, first of all, in-house discipline once we decided to go forward. And we had to stay behind a multilateral negotiation. And this is exactly what the president announced on March 16th of 1993, that we would do this in concert with the international community. The OAS and the UN had named a gentleman named Dante Caputo, a former Argentine foreign minister, to be their envoy. We had met, there were 3 other countries interested in sort of being what they call the Friends of Haiti. That was Argentina, Argentina came in later. It was Canada, France, and Venezuela. All of them were watching this situation and were on top of things. So we formed the group. It was Dante Caputo, the 3 other friends, and myself that began putting together the basis of a negotiation. Now, there were 2 elements to the negotiation. One was to get enough pressure on the military, through one means or another, to step down. And that was Cedras and some of the military commanders, and have a changeover in military command, so you could have a command structure which would be responsive to and obeisant to a civilian government. Secondly, you had to have a change in the political climate in that country, and you had to have Aristide become the major actor, first in bringing about reconciliation, which was in his interest, and secondly, forming a broader-based political coalition. Because to return him to what we had in September of 90, or 91, I'm sorry, would be returning him back into an unstable situation. So you wanted the change in the military and the building of a stronger political base for this nascent democracy. I mean, the term democracy in Haiti has got to be looked at very carefully. There are no institutions that would buttress a democracy. You've got to build every one of them. There's no judicial system. the public sector is a sham. There is no history of coordination, cooperation, sharing, and so on. The media is hardly a media that you would consider a responsible one. The educational level is so low, 85% or so illiteracy. So you're working at a very basic level, and if you don't build something that's going to stand there, and this was our position all along, then what we would have would be a return of the president with fanfare and so on, but you would not have the makings of anything durable. So the whole negotiating effort was aimed at getting the military to concede and getting out, and Aristide to build on reconciliation and a stronger political base of support. I'll go very quickly. We pressured both sides, and both were reluctant. Cedras was convinced from his experience that he could wait out the international community, that he could tough it out. He had pretty good information, even within our system, indicating that, the Clinton administration didn't have the nerve. We're a great country when it comes to negotiating with people. Aristide, on the other hand, had firmly in his mind, from the beginning, it's still there, that he would go back only if the ground was cleared for him. That is to say, we called it the Immaculate Conception internally. Namely, he wanted a new creation, nothing there to hinder him, and he comes back as the second coming, and then everything is fine. Both of those points of view were just ridiculous. So we put pressure on the military by putting sanctions in June of last year, and then when Cedras indicated a willingness to meet, we then got Aristide to come to Governor's Island. And there we came up with an agreement. Substantively, it was very sound. Spiritually, it was not. Aristide refused to meet with Cedras. His advisors refused to meet with the military advisors. So we were in the middle, brokering constantly between the very people who had to solve the problem in Haiti. It wasn't going to be Caputo, Pezzullo, and the other three that were going to run Haiti. It had to be Haitians. But we went through this ballet and got an agreement that at least had a series of steps that pushed them in a direction which brought about the end result that we sought, namely the return of a constitutional government, the change in military command, and the return of Aristide. Those were all central to the thing. Underlying it all was reconciliation and the building of a larger coalition. We then began a series of maneuvers on both sides to avoid taking the steps that were necessary. I won't bore you with all of them because it's not important at this point. I'll answer questions if you like. But slowly, and in a country where reality is mixed with mystery and fiction all the time, slowly we were moving them. No question about it. People were starting to fall into line. The private sector, which was almost to a man, anti-Aristide because they were afraid he would come in and topple the whole private sector market economy, through our pressure came to the realization that there wouldn't be a Haiti, there wouldn't be a private sector if you didn't move back, that this country was eating itself up. So they began to see that it was in their interest to go to a system, but they wanted guarantees. In fact, that everybody wanted guarantees. The military wanted guarantees. Aristide wanted guarantees. The private sector wanted guarantees. The church wanted guarantees. You felt as if you were selling refrigerators. So the point was, how do you guarantee all these things? How do you assure people, all of them concerned about someone else, how do you convince them that the international community is not going to bug out? And that concern led to the following proposal that we developed into a policy. Namely, we would provide not only multilateral assistance of a technical nature in all the major ministries. We would help build a new judiciary. We would help create a new civilian police force. We would retrain the military in a new mission, and that mission would be synonymous to what you would consider engineering type of work. We call it civic action, that type of stuff. We would also provide, during this interim, enough international presence of all sorts, observers, technicians, and very importantly, some military and police. And that was what became the central issue that was undercut by Harlan County. Now, the idea was to insert into the country trainers who would begin training the military, CBs who would be doing projects with the military in civilian areas to show that the military actually could do something for the Haitian people, which would be a change right there. And the police, which would be mostly Canadian Mounties, would begin to work with the local police force. And then slowly, as we integrated into these units and began to work with them, and they saw that professionalism in the military was a goal, that we were not trying to destroy the military, and that the police there had a future if they fell into a structure that was apolitical, professional, well-trained, and so on. They began to see this, and we brought some advanced groups in to begin the conversations. But the largest component was coming in on the Harlan County. And interestingly, how these things happen in history, when we began talking about the number, and some of my very good friends in the Pentagon were extremely willing to help in this. They said at one point, you know, it'd be a lot easier if we could have one contingent, the first contingent, to come in on a ship, because then we could bring in the road graders and the front loaders and all of that stuff, because these were basically engineering types. And then we could leave the ship there in the harbor for a couple of days, and it could be used as a supply ship and a hospital ship and actually a floating hotel until we put the camp up. My concern when the first was mentioned was that this is going to look obtrusive. It'd be better to bring them in 10s and 20s and 30s with the Blue Berets. By the way, this was all a UN-sponsored concept, shared cost, with an American commander of the military and a Canadian commander of the police. And they were going to number totally about 1,300, 400. And the concept of bringing them in small groups was always in the back of my mind. But it sounded awfully convincing. Bring them in a ship, use it as a supply base, and so on. And that was a mistake, because it gave opportunity to a bunch of ruffians to be on the dock and create a little theater. I do want to touch on this because it is a central issue here. As I mentioned before, there was always resistance within the U.S. government to the concept of a negotiated settlement and the return of Aristide from the intelligence community and from civilians in the military, not the uniformed military. Our military were going in basically as trainers and as engineers. They were not going in with combat gear. They were not going in with helmets. They were not going to look as if they came in to invade the country. They were going to come in unobtrusively, but they were going to be a presence. And the whole concept was we would be there to get the Haitians to make the decisions about their own security and their own rehabilitation and their own reconciliation themselves. It's not going to be an American or a Canadian to do it for them. And I like that idea because it put responsibility where it should have been, on the Haitians. Well, these toughs on the dock came just a week after Aidid in Somalia gave us a bloody nose and they killed some 18 Rangers. And the day of the decision, I was the only person in the room saying that ship should go in. In fact, there was not even a debate. There was not even a discussion of the consequences. And the consequences were were just catastrophic because, first of all, by pulling that ship out, we looked as if the United States of America didn't have the grit to stand up to a bunch of toughs on the dock. Now, the reason I say that is because these same toughs on the dock were around that country for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and every time we stared them down, in fact, our charge at the time is about a 104-pound woman, Vicki Huddleston, who was at every one of these demonstrations. When it happened in front of the City Hall and when it happened at the Minister of Finance, she was there with Dante Caputo, who weighs maybe 135, imploring these people to get out of the way and then calling the police to break them up. I mean, that's how much of a problem they were. Nobody was hurt. There were some shootings at the municipality, but by and large there was nothing resembling real rioting. So there was no reason to believe these toughs on the dock would cause us any problem. But the basic unwillingness of some elements of the administration to go for the policy from the beginning. In other words, there was a group of people advising the president that this was a dangerous mission, or that, as I said before, it would never work in the first place. And the decision was made to pull the ship around. So we not only looked sick, but Caputo, who was there building up this mission, he had then about 250 observers who were going to all the police stations and all around the country looking at human rights abuses and so on. They were pulled out immediately. They had to. If American soldiers couldn't land, if it was too dangerous for American soldiers, how could you ask civilians with T-shirts and baseball caps to go around the country going into police stations and asking about human rights abuses? So they left. All the civilians related to the UN mission left. The Canadians who had an advance team left. Our military advance team left. And Dante Caputo was left with his satellite telephone. It's about all he had left after that episode. I went down on that Thursday. It was the day they killed Guy Mallory, the minister of justice, really a precious guy. And the whole thing was coming apart. And I got a call immediately. I didn't get off the airplane when they wanted to know what they could do in Washington. They suddenly realized we were hemorrhaging. And I said, I'll give you a thought. Oh, let me think about it. And the next morning at 7, I called the secretary and said, put destroyers in here. We've got to stop this. We've got to show we stand for something. And the destroyers went in. And that began the patrolling. It was the only way we could deal with what was a terribly embarrassing situation. Besides everything else, it convinced Cedras and the military that they could stonewall us and stare us down. And it convinced Aristide that the only way he'd ever go back is to lobby our government and force our government to get him back through military action. That's exactly what happened. If there was any doubt in his mind, he was very reluctant to come to Governor's Island. After the Harlan County, there was no reluctance on his part. So we lost it on all sides. But you go forward in these things. I mean, you don't throw in the towel. We moved ahead. We had poor Malval as prime minister, trying desperately to run a country under the most adverse conditions. We worked with him, tried to help him build up a coalition. Every attempt was shot down by Aristide. Finally, Malval in mid-December came up with a proposal to hold a national conference because he saw the country, because sanctions had been reimposed after the Harlan County incident, so desperately divided, so desperately suffering, that ultimately there would be a break point. And he thought this was a time to open it up to a large dialogue of Haitian people. I never could quite understand what he was getting at in terms of how big this dialogue was and how many people, but his point was, and it was a central point and a perfectly legitimate point, we Haitians have to come to grips with governing our country. We've got to get well-intentioned people from all sectors, the church, the political parties, the labor unions, the parliamentarians, even within the military, to find out a way to live together and govern ourselves. Aristide would have nothing of it. And that was the end of Malval. He ended in December. There were a couple of other things that we tried to do with the military to put more sanctions on, which again, I had problems in getting the administration to move on. But then the real break point came in February, March, when growing out of Malval's discussions, within the country itself, especially among parliamentarians and the private sector, they began petitioning us to do something to break the impasse. There was no government. Malval was out. The military and some of their kooky allies were running around thinking up strange ideas of impeaching the president, imposing some other president, which they did later on. And the vacuum of power was palpable. They said, we have to do something with this. And they came up with the idea of building some sort of parliamentary coalition. The private sector was willing to support it. Some elements of the military, who never did like Cedras, looked upon it as a way of putting pressure on Cedras. So we engaged in it. And we invited a group of parliamentarians up here to include the presidents of both houses, because in the Constitution, nothing of major importance can happen without the two presidents there. The head of the coalition that Aristide ran on, the Conacom group, a gentleman named Victor Benoit, old-time politician, socialist, left of center. A senator from the right, Julio Larousselier, tough guy, knows the military, but a gutsy fella, who felt we needed democracy, we have to fight to build it. And two other people, one who had come out of the president's own coalition called the Presidential Commission, a fellow named Michel Gaillard, who was a socialist and a labor union organizer and knew Aristide for 10 years or more. They came up and began dealing with Aristide and with us. And it was during that terrible cold spell in Washington in early February when you couldn't move. And we went on at night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning with them. Some of the times there was something out of a Fellini movie. I mean, heart attacks, people going to the hospital, all kinds of stuff. But out of it, you know, the genius of people is that when they bang on something long enough, they start to make some headway. And they began to see and to argue among themselves, but to come to some consensus that they had to present to their president, who was very reluctant, they knew that, to accept anything. They had to present a package that satisfied all his concerns. And when they'd ask us about it, we would tell them what his concerns were. So, well, you've got to address this. He's going to want to know when he goes back. He's going to want to know how you deal with some of the constitutional provisions that could lead to impeachment. He's going to want to know how you protect him from a prime minister who can have enough power to rule without him, and so on. You're going to have to give him clarity about what happens to Cedras and some of the other military. And one or two of these people had wires into some of the military in Haiti, and goodness knows what their telephone bills were, but they were calling back and forth, and they forged over a series of weeks, 3 weeks to be exact, a program for the return of a constitutional government, the departure of Cedras, the return of the president. They thought they had satisfied every one of Aristide's concerns, although he never was forthcoming with them. And at the final meeting on a Thursday, they brought it into him, and he took it and handed it to one of his subordinates and said he was leaving for Paris the next day. And they said, Mr. President, we really think you should stay because this is a key moment in history, and we're willing to stay as long as you want. And he just kissed them off, left, and then announced from outside the country that their proposal was a trick. It was an attempt to steal power from him, power sharing. It was all done by the military. And then suddenly his lobby in this country began to take up the cudgels. And before you know it, there were congressmen outside the White House being arrested and declarations made that we're putting too much pressure on Aristide, that it was just unconscionable to ask this man to be president. and to comply with his own constitution. And that led, after some pushing within, and I was convinced that the administration would hold on this one. In fact, the vice president met with Aristide about the 26th of April and made clear to him that all the elements in this package conformed to what he said he wanted, plus we would be the overseer. We would ensure that none of these things could be in any way worked to his disadvantage, whether it be his return or the use of power by the prime minister. We gave him a whole series of guarantees, again, that we would not recognize a government that went contrary to this agreement. We would not recognize a prime minister who usurped power, and so on. And we would ensure that the date of his return, which we thought he and his prime minister should work out rather than throw it out in the press, would be obeyed. And we would hold it. We would hold the prime minister, and we would hold the rest of the parliament to it. But he turned it down. Within 3 days, he turned it down. He was approached on the Friday before Palm Sunday. He turned it down in the week in between. And by Saturday, instead of him breaking, the Clinton administration broke. They decided they could not take the public pressure, and they went into Aristide and said, "We will not push you anymore. We will follow your agenda," which meant military intervention. I sent the letter to the secretary then. I couldn't stay on. There was nothing to do. And in the letter, I said just that. I said, if you had supported me when the Harlan County incident came up, when we were going to put sanctions on in January, and during this recent interregnum with the parliamentarians, we could have done this. We could have worked this one. But now you've led yourself irrevocably toward intervention. Now let me end that one and go to where we are now. As you can understand, I don't believe you restored democracy at the point of a gun. This is an absurdity. But we're there now. And the question is, how do we extract ourselves in a meaningful way and at least have some benefit to show for this intervention? And it goes back to some of the basic things. The great danger now, and it's very great, is that we will destroy the military. I'm not saying that the violators of human rights, and we had a list of 200 and some odd, shouldn't be cashiered out of that military and face whatever penalties they should pay. No question there. I'm talking about the other 5,000, 6,000 soldiers and police who, if you remove, you will end up with no security forces at all. And if you have no security forces at all, and we're moving there slowly, the United States of America and other internationals will be the security forces of Haiti. And you'll have to build a security force on the basis from ground zero. Very dangerous, very difficult, and most likely you'll build a military and a police just as corrupt as the ones we've had in the past. Our experience in Nicaragua and elsewhere is classic. We've done it before, and I don't think we should try it again. The better model is what's happening in El Salvador, where the two protagonists, namely the military and the FMLN, finally said, enough, we've bloodied one enough, long enough, we're going to make peace. And believe it or not, the current police force of El Salvador is built from candidates from those two organizations, and they work hand in glove. And they work very well, and the police force is doing very nicely. But there you've had the reconciliation, there you've had the people themselves come together, not the United States of America banging heads or eliminating. So number one, we've got to get Aristide to begin taking some acts that are very specific. One, he's got to name a new prime minister who has the consensual capability to build that coalition of forces within the legitimate parliament. And we know who the legitimate parliament is. That's essential. Otherwise, he can't govern. He'll again have a minority prime minister, and he'll have to either circumvent the Constitution or act by decree. In either case, there goes your democracy in the first shot. Secondly, the amnesty issue should be dealt with quickly and gotten over. And the Haitians should come up with the amnesty decree. They talked about it last year, and they were very close to it. What usually happens is that when there isn't an interest in passing it, or people start to play games on it, then of course you can tie up a legislature. Look at what we do in Washington with great skill. Third, you got to name a new commander-in-chief. Cedras is out. By the 15th, he's gone. You've got to have a new commander-in-chief, somebody who can start being seen as the man who's going to rally these newly trained and responsive military, and do it quickly. You've got to pass a law which outlaws these thugs and attachés and all these paramilitaries. Do it legally. Do it legally. Do it through your parliament. And lastly, there are a couple of other things I won't bore you with. Lastly, Aristide should be back. He should be back tomorrow. Aristide should be the president of that country, not our ambassador or anybody else. He should be back there reconciling those people quickly and being a symbol of a country that's going to pull together and hopefully survive. Those, at least, it seems to me, are the bare minimums. We've got to put a lot of pressure on scrupulous concern for the Constitution, abiding by it, and building the beginning, for the first time in Haiti, of some sort of central consensus. Let me just end by saying two things. Haiti very often has been referred to as the country of the infinite impossibilities. Haitians tell you this. It's a very interesting comment. The second comment, which is a weird reality, but it's true. In this country and any functioning democracy, there is almost a magnetic pull toward the center. You'll see it in any country. Any functioning democracy, some Looney Tune comes out on the extremes, and he either fizzles or he's brought into the center. Most politicians end up there. And whether Democrats and Republicans want to admit it or not, they're so darn close to one another, half of them don't know what side of the aisle they're on. They're driven toward the center. Haiti is the difference. It's like some sort of monstrous centrifuge which throws everything off to the extreme, which drives people to idiocy and lunacy. And the center, anybody in the center, is constantly under pressure. These parliamentarians who came up here, who I think risked their lives and showed to me a certain patriotism, went home. The military went after them because they thought they were trying to unseat Cedras, which they were trying to do, of course, and Aristide's people went after them. Half of them were in hiding. Julio Laduselier just went back. He was on the picture in the Washington Post. He was in Chicago. The rest of them were hiding. So the center is a dangerous place to be in Haiti. And if we do nothing else, if we don't start building that center, there's no political peace. There's no social peace in that country. You don't build it on the back of American troops.
It's been our great privilege to be with you this evening. We thank you so much.